Well, Senator Hawley, not that this is a surprise, but that was the tour de force. And there are a lot of things I want to ask you about, but you've come over between votes, and so we probably have time for just a few questions. Yeah. But thanks again.
Thank you.
I'm particularly grateful. I speak on behalf of all of us at Heritage, the several 100,000 everyday Americans who support our work financially every year, even some who supported very strictly defined military aid for Ukraine. What they tell me, even in trips that I took to Florida and Texas this week, is that they feel hoodwinked. And they feel hoodwinked by the Uniparty. So a statement before the question: the Heritage Foundation will stand with you and any member of the Senate who wants to fight the Uniparty. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'll talk to that.
And the reason for that is, as you identify, the first question we need to ask in foreign policy is, what's in the best interest of the Americans? Right. And typically, when we're at our best, our most virtuous, we've made mistakes as a people, that affects, in a good way, people around the world. It leads to this question. What's the root cause of this misguided thinking in DC, given all of the data that you pointed out, the other data that's out there? That is to say, it's so apparent that the much graver threat to the American people is China. There are smart people in DC, even some who might disagree with you and me in Heritage. How do we fix that? That's the urgency that I'm hearing from people in America. How do we actually break that stranglehold that misguided thinking has on policy in this town?
I think that part of it is that with the fall of the Cold War, with the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, we really had a Wilsonian moment in American foreign policy that has now extended into Wilsonian decades. You know, and Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, as you may remember, was a dedicated internationalist. He was a dedicated globalist on principle, by the way. I mean, he thought that we should make the world safe for democracy. That was his line that he famously used. And I think what you saw is after the Cold War, you had a whole generation of American policymakers who said, the Wilsonian moment has now arrived. Borders don't matter. American uniqueness doesn't matter. We're going to make all of the world more like America, and we're going to make America more like the world. And there'll be this great global integration. The first President Bush promoted something like this. He talked about open trade, open borders, open minds. I just think it turned out to be a spectacularly bad idea. And I think that for a whole generation of policymakers, they've not been able to free themselves from the grip of this Wilsonianism, and they haven't been able to understand that pursuing it actually undermines American exceptionalism and actually undermines American strength. Here's the last thing I'd say on that, Kevin. I do think there's a class element to this. Mm-hmm. Listen, this is something else that we ought to be frank about, and nobody in this town likes to talk about it. But the current economic order and the current foreign policy order favors a particular class of people. It favors people who have four-year college degrees or advanced degrees. It favors people who have the credentials to prosper in the hyper-globalist economy that we have. That's who it favors. Who does it not favor? The people who fight our wars, working-class people. Who does it not favor? Blue-collar workers. Who does it not favor? People who actually don't have much of a voice in Washington. So I think one of the reasons that the Uniparty is so fixated on this and can't disentangle themselves from these notions is they don't actually feel some of the pain that most Americans are bearing, because they belong to a pretty narrow class of folks, and they're more and more divorced from the whole rest of America, and that's a huge, huge problem that infects all of our politics.
It does, and I want to ask you a directly related follow-up question about how that dynamic affects what seems to be a rethinking on the political right about foreign policy. You are one of the leaders of that rethinking, and that is, if you go to 2024, 2030, I don't want to make this about presidential politics necessarily, but about the movement writ large, which is more important than any election. I think even you would agree with that. And it's this: is it the project of American conservatism now to embrace the hard reality of what you just described and articulate in a positive way, one where America is still rather strong, but perhaps more restrained? Is that the object that some conservatives are talking about when they are calling for a working class conservatism?
Well, it's certainly what I mean when I talk about working class conservatism, and I think it's what we should all mean. And listen, there's a history for this in our party. For those of us who are conservatives and Republicans, there's a history of this. It does not mean isolationism. Listen, I want to be clear about this. I'm not an isolationist. I come from a state that our number one industry is agriculture. We want to trade, but we want to trade on fair terms that are good for us. We want to see our own industry thrive. We want to see manufacturing jobs come back to this country and the jobs of the future take root in this country. In our party, There is a number of historical parallels for this, going all the way back to Theodore Roosevelt and William McKinley, the turn of the last century. Listen, we were a nationalist party that was nationalist economically and nationalist on foreign policy. We were not isolationists. Roosevelt was many things. In fact, he had an imperialist episode that I don't recommend to you. Skip over that. He got over it. But
it's quite an episode.
It was long. It was long. But listen, we were a nationalist foreign policy party. So there's a tradition of that in our movement, in our party, that we can recover, and we should. And what that means is that we look at the world and we ask, what is going to make America safe? What is going to make America prosperous? What's going to protect the American people and all of the American people? Not just the people who do well in the globalist economy, but all of the American people. And I think you said it right. When we do that, when we protect the American dream, when we allow the American project to flourish, that's really part of our gift to the world. So do I think America has a role to play in the world? Yeah, you bet I do. You bet I do. But that begins with being strong here at home and protecting our folks.
Well, I appreciate the response, because in my short time here in D.C., I've learned that among many criticisms someone might have of the imperial city, the one that I would offer is that it's the city of false dichotomies. So for those of us who are Reaganites, believe in peace through strength, support very narrow, strict military aid to Ukraine, never imagined that it would go above $100 billion, but I guess not surprised. We were billed, Heritage was billed, you were billed, many of your colleagues billed as pro-Putin, as if to say that merely wanting accountability for the Americans' dollar, recognizing there are graver threats to our self-governance, namely China, that somehow we're isolationists. And so I'm curious, you've got some new members in the Senate, we've got some new great House members as well. It's a question about optimism. Maybe I'm desperate for it. Give us a view into your crystal ball in terms of DC politics. Do you see having more in your ranks when it comes to this common sense foreign policy?
I do, and I think that's partly because it was Lincoln, I think, who said that in our democracy, what the American people want, if they want it long enough, they get it. And that's as it should be. I mean, that's what it means to be a democratic republic. So right now, what the American people, I think, have been trying to say, probably for decades, is that they reject the Uniparty consensus. Listen, there's a reason why, let's be honest, there's a reason why Donald Trump became the nominee of the Republican Party in 2016. There's a reason why Bernie Sanders almost became the nominee of the other party in 2016, and probably would have without those super delegates or however they cheated him. Anyway, just kidding.
I don't know. So there's something funny about super delegates.
No, there are. No, exactly. Just ask Bernie. But listen, there's a reason for that. My point is that voters in both parties from different political persuasions, but nonetheless, we're trying to send their party establishments, I think, a message. They do not like the political consensus, and nowhere more so than in foreign policy over the last few decades. Why? Because it hasn't worked for them. It has not worked for them. If you don't believe that, come to my state, and you can find in Missouri towns, small towns like the one I grew up in, that used to have local industry, that used to have good paying manufacturing jobs that are gone now. And you can tell them all you want that, everybody gains from trade. That it's, of course, it's a net positive. This is what I was taught in college, right? All trade is good. All trade is good. Doesn't matter if the terms are unfavorable. So yes, admit China to the WTO. Absolutely. Give them permanent most favored nation status. That's great. We'll benefit from it. The question, though, is who will benefit from it? We say we, but who particularly? And what we found is, for most of the American people, it isn't them. It's some, it's not most. And we've got to be honest about that. And as conservatives, we are in favor of conserving what? Families, neighborhoods, churches, these Burkean small platoons, little platoons that make our society what it is. And we need to see that our economic policy, our foreign policy, and our domestic cultural policy are all intertwined in this way.
I can see now why you were such a treasured Heritage intern.
I don't know about that.
Looking at some interns in the audience. No, I think so. Last question. Of course, I'd sit here with you for a few hours, but you've got to go attend to important votes. And we usually get to audience questions, so this one's kind of crowdsourced because of schedule, which everyone understands. We're grateful for your time. And we always try at Heritage not just to diagnose the problem and come up with solutions, but give our audience members, whether they're in person or online or viewing C-SPAN, watching this a few weeks from now, an action item. What can the everyday American do to further the great goals that you outlined?
Well, I think that what you can do is you can tell, in the most immediate sense, you can tell your member of Congress that listen, it's time to change course. And this is why I didn't directly answer your question about the future and having additional cohorts.
I was letting you off the hook.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'll come back. It's a typical, I answer my own question. You can ask any question.
You're a member of the Senate, sir. I knew that coming into this.
But I think that because voters want a change, you're seeing more members of Congress get elected. So I think the thing to do is, who favor that change, I think the thing to do is to make it just abundantly clear that we've got to change course, and we can start with the Ukraine aid. Listen, I voted for aid to Ukraine early on. I was in favor of targeted. I had no idea that we were going to fight an endless proxy war and do nation building there, because that's not what we said we were going to do in the beginning. But lo and behold, here we are now. So I think we should make abundantly clear the current policy has to stop. We can't just keep going on like we're going on. And we need to get back to the basics. As a party, we need to get back to our history. We need to be nationalists, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Senator Josh Hawley, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody.
God bless you. I'll get to speak first.
Thank you. Thank you.